The morning sun peeked through the clouds as Eleanor Williams, a 73-year-old retired school teacher, carefully knelt beside her flower bed, her weathered hands, marked with the signs of age and decades of hard work, gently pressed the soil around a young rosebush. This garden had been her pride for over 40 years, a colorful oasis on the corner lot that drew admiring glances from passersby in the suburban neighborhood. Eleanor hummed softly to herself, a habit she had developed during her 35 years of teaching second graders. The familiar tune helped ease the stiffness in her knees as she worked. Her garden was more than just a hobby. It was her connection to the past, to the grandmother who had first taught her how to coax life from the earth. From the corner of her eye, Eleanor noticed a curtain moving in the window of the house next door. The new neighbors had moved in about 6 months ago, but despite Eleanor's best efforts to welcome them, they had remained cold and distant. Karen Whitman, a white woman in her mid-40s, had barely opened the door when Eleanor brought over her famous sweet potato pie, a recipe passed down through generations of her family. Just trying to be neighborly, Eleanor had murmured to herself as Karen closed the door after taking the pie with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Since then, things had only gotten worse. Karen would stare whenever Eleanor worked in her garden. Sometimes, Eleanor would catch snippets of phone conversations as Karen stood on her porch, complaining loudly about property values and the changing neighborhood. Eleanor tried not to let it bother her. After all, she had seen much worse in her lifetime, having grown up in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. She had marched with her parents as a child and later participated in sit-ins during college. The sting of discrimination was familiar, but she had learned long ago that living well was its own form of resistance. This morning, Eleanor was planting new flowers along the border between the two properties. She was careful to stay within her property line, having had the land surveyed years ago when she installed the small white picket fence that marked the edge of her yard. The fence needed a fresh coat of paint this year, she noted, adding it to her mental to-do list. As Eleanor moved along the border, planting bright marigolds that would bloom throughout the summer, she heard the sound of a door slamming. Footsteps approached rapidly from behind. "Excuse me." Karen's sharp voice cut through the peaceful morning air. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Eleanor slowly rose to her feet, one hand pressed against her lower back to ease the ache there. She turned to face her neighbor with a calm expression. "Good morning, Karen. I'm just planting some marigolds. They'll keep the bugs away from the vegetables in the back garden." Karen's face was flushed, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "You're on my property." Eleanor shook her head gently. "No, dear, I'm on my side of the fence. This whole area belongs to my lot. I had it surveyed when I put in this fence back in '86. "That's not what my property papers say," Karen insisted, her voice rising. "And I told you before about your plants spreading onto my lawn. Those flowers will attract bees, and my son's allergic." Eleanor hadn't seen a child at the house next door, but she nodded understandingly. "I didn't know about the allergy, but these are on my property, well within the boundary line." Karen's eyes narrowed as she looked past Eleanor at the neat row of yellow and orange flowers. "We'll see about that," she muttered before turning sharply and walking back toward her house, phone already in hand. Eleanor sighed and looked down at her half-finished planting. The morning's peace was broken, but she would finish her work. This garden had outlasted many neighbors over the decades. It would outlast Karen Whitman, too. The tension between Eleanor and Karen grew worse over the next few weeks. Eleanor noticed Karen watching her from behind curtains whenever she worked in her garden. Sometimes Karen would take pictures with her phone, as if collecting evidence of some crime Eleanor couldn't understand. One evening, as Eleanor watered her tomato plants, she found a letter stuck in her mailbox. It was from the Homeowners Association. With a sigh, she took it inside to read at her kitchen table, the same table where she had graded countless papers during her teaching years. "Dear Ms. Williams," the letter began, "we have received a complaint about excessive vegetation along your property line." Eleanor shook her head. This was the third complaint letter in 2 months. Each time, she had invited the HOA representative to inspect her property. Each time, they found nothing wrong. Her garden was neat, her grass was cut, and everything was within the rules they had given her. "Someone sure is persistent," Eleanor murmured to herself as she placed the letter in a folder with the others. She would call Mr. Jenkins, the HOA president, in the morning. The next day was Saturday, and Eleanor was up early to beat the heat. As she enjoyed her morning coffee on the porch, she noticed other neighbors were active too. The Martinez family was setting up for their son's birthday party. Mr. Peterson was walking his dog. Miss Chen was returning from her morning jog. When Eleanor stepped into her garden with her tools, she saw Karen was already outside, standing at the edge of her driveway with her arms crossed, watching. Eleanor nodded politely and went about her work. "Good morning, Miss Eleanor," called Diane Chen, stopping her job to chat. "Your roses look beautiful this year." "Thank you, dear," Eleanor replied with a smile. "Would you like a few cuttings for your yard?" As the two women talked, Eleanor noticed Karen's face growing redder. Finally, Karen marched over to the fence. "Excuse me," she interrupted loudly. "I need to speak with you about this jungle you're creating." Diane raised her eyebrows but said nothing. "Good morning, Karen," Eleanor said calmly. "What seems to be the problem today?" "The problem is that you've ignored all the notices about your overgrown garden," Karen snapped. "The LOA has rules for a reason." "I've responded to every notice," Eleanor explained patiently. "Mr. Jenkins himself has come by twice and found everything in order." "Well, he obviously wasn't looking carefully enough," Karen insisted. "And now you're putting in more plants. Those sunflowers will be taller than the fence. They'll block my view." Eleanor looked at the small sunflower seedlings she had just planted. "They'll only bloom for a few weeks in late summer, Karen, and they'll be on my side of the fence." Diane, who had been watching the exchange with growing concern, stepped closer. "I think Eleanor's garden is the nicest one on the block. The whole neighborhood loves it." Karen turned to glare at Diane. "This isn't about what looks nice. It's about following rules. Some people think they can just do whatever they want." The way Karen said, "some people," made Eleanor's heart sink. She had heard that tone many times before in her life. It was the tone that meant she was being seen as different, as less deserving of respect. "If you have concerns about the HOA rules," Eleanor said softly, "perhaps we could review them together. I've kept copies of all the guidelines." "I don't need to review anything with you," Karen snapped. "I know what the rules are, and I know when someone is pushing boundaries." As Karen stormed back to her house, Eleanor and Diane exchanged looks. "She's been like this with anyone else?" Diane asked quietly. Eleanor shook her head. "Not that I've seen. The Martinez family has the same kind of garden I do. The Johnsons have wind chimes and yard decorations. Mr. Peterson's fence needs painting worse than mine. But she only complains about you," Diane finished for her. Eleanor nodded, her hands returning to the soil, finding comfort in its cool touch. "It's an old story, dear. Some things change, but some stay the same." Diane squeezed Eleanor's shoulder before continuing her jog. "We're watching, Miss Eleanor. You're not alone here." As more neighbors came out to enjoy the beautiful day, many stopped to compliment Eleanor's garden. Each kind word helped wash away the bitter taste of Karen's anger. But Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their troubles. The following weekend brought perfect gardening weather. The sky was clear, with just enough clouds to provide occasional relief from the sun. Eleanor had decided to install a small greenhouse in her backyard, something she had dreamed about for years. Her son Michael had helped her order a kit online, and today was the day she would begin setting it up. Eleanor spread the greenhouse parts on her lawn and studied the instructions. Her glasses slid down her nose as she leaned forward, trying to make sense of the diagrams. Just as she was sorting the metal rods by size, a shadow fell across the paper in her hands. "Miss Eleanor, need some help?" It was James Wilson, a college student who lived with his parents 2 houses down. He had often helped Eleanor with heavier garden work. "Oh, James, you're a blessing." Eleanor smiled up at him. "These instructions might as well be in another language." James laughed and knelt down beside her. "Let me take a look. I put together something similar for my mom last year." As they worked together, more neighbors stopped by. Diane Chen brought over lemonade. Michael Brennan, the retired judge from across the street, offered tools from his garage. Soon, what had started as a simple project became a small neighborhood gathering. The frame of the greenhouse began to take shape in Eleanor's backyard, well within her property line and following all HOA guidelines. The happy chatter and occasional laughter must have caught Karen's attention. Eleanor noticed her neighbor standing at her kitchen window, phone pressed to her ear, watching the activity with narrowed eyes. Eleanor sighed. Karen finds a problem with most things I do, but this greenhouse is perfectly allowed. I checked the HOA rules twice and even called Mr. Jenkins to make sure. Around noon, when the greenhouse frame was mostly assembled and the neighbors were enjoying lemonade and Eleanor's homemade cookies, Karen finally emerged from her house. She marched directly toward Eleanor's yard, her face set in a hard expression. "What is going on here?" Karen demanded, standing at the edge of Eleanor's property. "What are you building?" Eleanor stepped forward, wiping her hands on a small towel. "Hello, Karen. We're putting up a small greenhouse. Would you like some lemonade?" Karen ignored the offer. "Do you have permission for this structure?" "The HOA has strict rules about permanent buildings." "It's not permanent," Eleanor explained calmly. "It can be disassembled if needed. And yes, I checked with Mr. Jenkins. It's within the guidelines." "I find that hard to believe," Karen scoffed, pulling out her phone. "I'm taking pictures of this. The committee will want to see what you're doing." Judge Brennan stepped forward, his tall frame casting a shadow. "Karen, isn't it? I'm Michael Brennan. I'm on the HOA committee. Eleanor is correct. This greenhouse meets all our requirements." Karen's eyes darted between Eleanor and Judge Brennan. "Well, it's an eyesore, and it's going to lower property values." "Actually," Diane cut in, "gardens and greenhouses are quite desirable features these days. If anything, Eleanor's beautiful yard raises all our property values." Karen's face flushed red. She pointed at Eleanor's garden tools spread on the lawn. "Those are my pruning shears. I've been looking for them for weeks." The accusation hung in the air. Everyone turned to look at the garden tools, a collection of well-worn but well-cared-for implements that clearly matched Eleanor's other gardening equipment. "Karen," Eleanor said quietly, "these are my tools. I've had them for years. Some even belong to my mother." "You're lying," Karen insisted, her voice rising. "Those are the same pruning shears that went missing from my garage last month. You took them?" The neighbors exchanged uncomfortable glances. James stepped closer to Eleanor protectively. "That's a serious accusation," Judge Brennan said, his voice firm but calm. "Do you have proof those tools belong to you?" Karen pointed to the pruning shears. "They're the same brand as mine. She must have taken them when I wasn't home." Eleanor shook her head sadly. "These were a gift from my late husband on our 35th anniversary. His initials are engraved on the handle." She picked up the shears and showed the small JW etched into the metal near the handle. Karen's eyes narrowed. She looked around at the neighbors watching her, then back at Eleanor. "People like you think you can do whatever you want," she said, her voice cold. "But I'm watching you." With that, she turned and stormed back to her house, slamming the door behind her. A heavy silence fell over the group. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she set the pruning shears down. "Don't you worry about her, Ms. Eleanor," James said finally. "We all know the truth." Eleanor nodded, but her heart was heavy. She had faced prejudice many times in her long life, but it never stopped hurting. Eleanor tried to forget about the unpleasant confrontation, but Karen's accusation lingered in her mind. She found herself being extra careful whenever she worked in her garden, especially in areas near the property line. Judge Brennan had advised her to document any further incidents, so Eleanor kept a small notebook on her porch table where she recorded dates and times of Karen's strange behavior. 3 days after the greenhouse incident, Eleanor was weeding around her tomato plants when she heard Karen's door slam. She didn't look up, hoping to avoid another confrontation. From the corner of her eye, she saw Karen pacing up and down her driveway, talking loudly on her phone. "Yes, that's right. She's out there again," Karen said, making no effort to lower her voice. "I told you before about this woman. I don't feel safe." Eleanor pretended not to hear, focusing on pulling a stubborn dandelion from between her tomato stakes. The sun was warm on her back, and she had been looking forward to a peaceful morning in her garden. "She threatened me the other day," Karen continued, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "There were witnesses, but they're all friends of hers." Eleanor's hand stilled. This was a complete lie. She had never threatened anyone in her life, especially not Karen. She looked up and saw Diane Chen slowing her car as she drove past, watching the scene with concern. Eleanor gave a small wave to show she was okay and returned to her weeding. She would not give Karen the satisfaction of a response. Instead, she began to hum softly, an old gospel song her mother used to sing when times were tough. Karen's voice grew louder. Yes, right now. She's clearly trespassing on my property. No, I can't wait. I don't know what she might do. Eleanor looked down at her feet. She was at least 3 feet away from the property line, well within her own yard. She had been extra careful since their last encounter. With a sigh, she gathered her gardening tools and decided to move to another section of the garden, farther from Karen's watchful eyes. As Eleanor bent to pick up her basket of gardening tools, she heard Karen's triumphant voice. Thank you. Yes, the address is 1423 Maple Street. Please hurry. A chill ran down Eleanor's spine despite the warm morning sun. Had Karen really called the police? Over what? Eleanor was simply tending her own garden, as she had done for 40 years. Judge Brennan, who had been washing his car in his driveway across the street, walked over to Eleanor's yard. Everything all right over here, Eleanor? Before she could answer, Karen called out from her yard, Stay out of this, Mr. Brennan. This is between me and her. Judge Brennan raised his eyebrows but kept his voice calm. Just checking on my neighbor. It's what good neighbors do. Well, good neighbors don't steal tools or threaten people, Karen snapped. I've called the police, and they're on their way. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. At 73, she had never had trouble with the law. The idea of police coming to her home because of false accusations made her heart race uncomfortably. Michael, she says she called the police, Eleanor said quietly to Judge Brennan. I wasn't doing anything wrong, I was just weeding my tomatoes. I know, Eleanor, he assured her. Don't worry, we'll sort this out. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Diane Chen, who had parked her car and walked back, stood beside Eleanor. James Wilson came out of his house and headed toward them. Mrs. Martinez stepped onto her porch, baby on her hip, watching with concern. Within 15 minutes, the distinctive sound of police sirens could be heard in the distance. Eleanor's hands shook as she placed her gardening tools in their proper places in her basket, a habit from decades of teaching. Everything in its place. I haven't done anything wrong, she whispered, more to herself than to the neighbors who had gathered protectively around her. We know, Diane said firmly, placing a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. And we're not going anywhere. The police cruiser turned onto Maple Street, lights flashing. Karen stood at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, a satisfied expression on her face. Eleanor straightened her back and raised her chin, the way her mother had taught her to face difficulty. She had lived through harder times than this. She would not be intimidated in her own garden. The police car stopped in front of the houses, and 2 officers stepped out. Eleanor took a deep breath as they approached, their expressions unreadable behind sunglasses. 2 police officers approached Eleanor's yard. A tall white man with graying hair and a younger Latino officer. Their badges read Officer Stevens and Officer Rodriguez. Karen immediately hurried toward them, waving her arms. Thank goodness you're here, Karen said loudly. That's her, right there. She's been threatening me and trespassing on my property for weeks. Officer Stevens took out a small notebook. Ma'am, please calm down and tell us exactly what happened. Eleanor stood quietly, her weathered hands clasped in front of her. Judge Brennan moved closer to stand beside her, along with Diane Chen and James Wilson. Other neighbors watched from porches and driveways. She was digging on my property just now, Karen insisted, pointing at Eleanor. And when I asked her to stop, she threatened me. This has been going on for months. She's stolen my garden tools, too. I've complained to the HOA multiple times. Officer Rodriguez looked at Eleanor, then at the gathered neighbors. Ma'am, he addressed Eleanor, would you mind telling us your side of the story? Before Eleanor could speak, Karen interrupted. She'll just lie. They're all covering for her. I have photos of her trespassing. She thrust her phone toward the officers. Officer Stevens held up his hand. Ma'am, please let us do our job. We need to hear from everyone. Eleanor took a deep breath. Officers, I was simply weeding my tomato plants this morning. I was well within my property line. Her voice was steady despite her racing heart. I have never threatened Karen or anyone else. and I certainly didn't steal any tools. I've lived in this house for over 40 years without any problems with neighbors." "She's lying," Karen interjected. "Look at the property line. She's clearly overstepped it with her plants and that greenhouse she put up without permission." Officer Rodriguez looked at the neat garden beds, the small greenhouse in the backyard, and the clear property line marked by Eleanor's white picket fence. "Where exactly do you believe your property line is, ma'am?" he asked Karen. Karen marched over and pointed to an area near Eleanor's tomato plants. "Everything from here is mine. Her plants are invading my yard." Judge Brennan cleared his throat. "Officers, if I may, I'm Michael Brennan, retired circuit court judge. I also serve on the EGOA committee. Ms. Williams has been meticulous about following property lines. We've had the properties surveyed multiple times over the years." Officer Stevens nodded at Judge Brennan with recognition. "Judge Brennan, I've testified in your courtroom a few times." Diane Chen stepped forward, holding up her phone. "Officers, I have video from the other day when Karen accused Eleanor of stealing her tools. I was jogging by and saw the whole thing. I started recording because I was concerned about how aggressive Karen was being." Officer Rodriguez took the phone, and both officers watched the video. It clearly showed Karen accusing Eleanor of theft, Eleanor showing the initials on her pruning shears, and Karen making the comment about "people like you." "I also have documentation of all the EGOA complaints filed by Ms. Whitman," Judge Brennan added. "Every one of them has been investigated and dismissed. She has only filed complaints against Ms. Williams, despite other neighbors having similar gardens, fences, and structures." More neighbors had gathered now. Mrs. Martinez approached with her baby. "Officers, Ms. Eleanor has been nothing but kind to everyone in this neighborhood. She brings vegetables from her garden to all of us. She helped teach my daughter to read when she was struggling in school." Mr. Peterson, an elderly white man who lived next door to Judge Brennan, spoke up. "I've lived here 30 years. Eleanor Williams is the heart of this community. This nonsense has gone on long enough." Officer Stevens turned to Karen, whose face had grown increasingly red. "Ma'am, do you have any evidence that Ms. Williams has threatened you or stolen your property?" "My word should be enough," Karen insisted. "I know what I saw, and I don't feel safe with her next door." Officer Rodriguez looked at Eleanor, who stood quietly with dignity despite the public humiliation. Then he glanced at the gathered neighbors, white, black, Latino, Asian, all united in support of Eleanor. "Ms. Whitman," Officer Stevens said firmly, "based on what we're seeing and hearing, there doesn't appear to be any evidence of trespassing, theft, or threats." "So you're taking her side?" Karen demanded. Officer Rodriguez removed his sunglasses. "We're not taking sides, ma'am. We're assessing the facts, and the facts don't support your claims." The tension in the air was thick. Eleanor felt both relief and sadness. She had never wanted trouble with any neighbor, especially not this kind of public spectacle. At her age, she just wanted peace in her beloved garden. Karen's face flushed deeper red as she realized the police weren't taking her side. She pointed frantically at Eleanor's garden. "Look at all this. It's excessive and against 8OA rules. And she's deliberately planting things to annoy me. Those flowers attract bees, and my son is allergic." Officer Rodriguez glanced around the quiet street. "Is your son here right now, ma'am?" Karen hesitated. "No, he's at his father's this weekend." "Does your son live with you full-time?" The officer continued. "That's none of your business," Karen snapped. "The point is she's breaking rules and threatening me." Officer Stevens exchanged a look with his partner. He turned to the gathered neighbors. "Has anyone here ever witnessed Ms. Williams threatening Ms. Whitman or anyone else?" A chorus of "no" came from the group. James Wilson stepped forward. "I've helped Ms. Eleanor with her garden for 3 years. She wouldn't harm a worm, let alone threaten a person." Officer Rodriguez walked over to examine the property line more closely. He bent down to look at where Karen had claimed Eleanor was trespassing. The tomato plants were clearly on Eleanor's side of the white picket fence, growing in neat rows with careful spacing. "Ms. Whitman," he called, "could you show me exactly where you believe Ms. Williams crossed onto your property?" Karen marched over, still clutching her phone. "Right here. These tomato plants are too close to the line." Officer Rodriguez measured the distance with his eyes. They appeared to be about 3 feet from the fence line, which is the property marker. The fence is in the wrong place, Karen insisted. My property extends further. Judge Brennan approached with a folder he had retrieved from his house. Officers, I have copies of the property surveys for both houses. The FOI keeps records of all property lines. He opened the folder to show detailed survey maps with clear boundary markers. While Officer Stevens reviewed the documents with Judge Brennan, Officer Rodriguez took Karen aside. Eleanor couldn't hear what they were saying, but Karen's gestures became increasingly agitated. Diane moved closer to Eleanor and squeezed her hand. Are you doing okay, Miss Eleanor? She asked softly. Eleanor nodded, though her heart was still racing. I just don't understand why she dislikes me so much. I tried to be friendly. Some people's hearts are just filled with anger, Diane replied. It has nothing to do with you. Officer Stevens finished reviewing the documents and rejoined his partner. They spoke quietly for a moment before addressing both women. Ladies, Officer Stevens began, we've reviewed the property documents and spoken with witnesses. There's no evidence of any trespassing or threats. But, Karen tried to interrupt. Please let me finish, Officer Stevens continued firmly. Ms. Whitman, making false reports to police is a serious matter. It wastes valuable resources and can have legal consequences. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Are you threatening me now? Officer Rodriguez shook his head. No, ma'am, we're informing you of the law. We're not going to take any action today, but we strongly advise you to work through proper channels like the HOA if you have legitimate concerns about your neighbor's property. Mrs. Martinez, who had been standing nearby with her baby, suddenly stepped forward. Officers, I have something to show you. She held up her phone. I set up a security camera after someone damaged my garden gnomes last month. It faces the street, but it also captures part of Ms. Eleanor's front yard. Everyone turned to look at her with interest. Yesterday, while Ms. Eleanor was at her doctor's appointment, she told me she'd be gone all afternoon. I saw someone in her garden. Mrs. Martinez continued. I didn't think much of it until now. She turned her phone to show a video. The footage was slightly grainy, but clear enough to show a figure moving around Eleanor's garden beds, examining her tools, and appearing to take photos of her plants. The person was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and sunglasses, but the bright floral shirt was unmistakable. It was the same one Karen was wearing now. A collective gasp went up from the neighbors. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth in shock. Officer Stevens turned slowly to face Karen. Miss Whitman, were you in Ms. Williams' yard without permission yesterday? Karen's face had gone pale beneath her angry flush. I was just checking to see if my missing tools were there. So you entered her property without permission, Officer Rodriguez clarified, and you took photos of her personal property. The weight of what was happening seemed to finally hit Karen. She looked around at the circle of neighbors, all watching her with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times as she struggled to find words. The evidence was clear on Mrs. Martinez's phone. Karen had trespassed in Eleanor's garden while she was away. I was just investigating, Karen finally stammered. She's been causing problems since I moved here. Officer Rodriguez shook his head slowly. Ma'am, entering someone else's property without permission is trespassing. That's actually what you accused Ms. Williams of doing. Officer Stevens took out his notebook again. In light of this new evidence, we need to file a report about this incident. Karen's eyes widened with panic. A report? Am I being arrested? Not at this time, Officer Stevens explained, but trespassing is a crime, and filing a false police report is also a crime. The crowd of neighbors had grown larger. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood about what was happening. People stood in small groups, watching with concerned expressions. Many had their phones out, recording the scene. This isn't fair. Karen's voice rose to a shrill cry. You're all against me because I'm the newcomer here. Diane Chen stepped forward. Ms. Whitman, I moved here just last year. Everyone welcomed me, including Ms. Eleanor. This isn't about you being new. It's about how you've treated people. Officer Rodriguez gestured for Karen to step aside with them. Ms. Whitman, we need to take your statement about entering Ms. Williams' property. His tone was professional but firm. As the officers spoke with Karen, Judge Brennan approached Eleanor, who was sitting quietly on her garden bench, looking shaken by the whole ordeal. "Are you all right, Eleanor?" he asked gently. Eleanor nodded slowly. "I just don't understand it, Michael. In all my years, I tried to be a good neighbor. My garden has always been a place of joy, not conflict." Judge Brennan patted her hand. "Some people carry their own storms inside them, Eleanor. They rain on others no matter how kind those people are." Mrs. Martinez joined them, bouncing her fussy baby on her hip. "Miss Eleanor, would you like some water? You've been out in this heat for too long." "That would be wonderful, dear," Eleanor replied with a grateful smile. While Mrs. Martinez went to get water, Officer Stevens approached Eleanor. "Ms. Williams, I'd like to take your statement as well, if you're feeling up to it." Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "Of course, officer." Officer Stevens asked Eleanor about the history of issues with Karen, taking careful notes. Eleanor recounted the incidents calmly, without exaggeration or anger. She described the HOI complaints, the accusations about stolen tools, and how Karen had become increasingly hostile over time. "Have you ever entered Ms. Whitman's property or taken anything belonging to her?" Officer Stevens asked. "Never," Eleanor said firmly. "I've been a teacher for 35 years before I retired. I've always taught my students to respect others and their property." Officer Stevens nodded and continued writing in his notebook. "Thank you for your cooperation, Ms. Williams. We'll need statements from the witnesses as well." Meanwhile, Officer Rodriguez was having a more difficult conversation with Karen. Her voice carried across the yard despite his attempts to speak privately with her. "This is ridiculous. I'm being targeted because I'm standing up for my property rights." Karen's face was flushed with anger. "I want to speak to your supervisor." Officer Rodriguez remained calm. "You're welcome to do that, ma'am. But the evidence is clear that you entered Ms. Williams' property without permission and then called the police with false accusations against her." As Mrs. Martinez returned with water for Eleanor, Officer Stevens rejoined his partner. The two officers spoke quietly for a moment before turning to address both women. "Here's what's going to happen," Officer Stevens announced. "We're filing a report about today's incident and Ms. Whitman's unauthorized entry onto Ms. Williams' property. The district attorney will decide if charges should be filed." Karen gasped. "Charges? This is outrageous." Additionally, Officer Rodriguez continued, "We're issuing you a citation for misuse of emergency services. Calling 911 for non-emergencies ties up resources needed for real emergencies." He handed Karen a yellow slip of paper. "You'll need to appear in court on the date listed here." Karen stared at the citation in disbelief. This was clearly not how she had expected the day to unfold. Her hands trembled as she took the paper. Eleanor watched from her bench, feeling no joy in Karen's distress despite everything the woman had put her through. In her long life, Eleanor had learned that anger and hatred only created more of the same. Officer Stevens turned to Eleanor. "Ms. Williams, do you wish to pursue trespassing charges?" All eyes turned to Eleanor as the neighborhood waited for her answer. Eleanor looked at Karen's flushed, angry face, then at the expectant faces of her neighbors and the police officers. The garden around her had always been a place of peace and growth, not conflict and punishment. She took a deep breath and made her decision. "No," Eleanor said finally, her voice soft but clear. "I don't want to press charges." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Karen's mouth fell open in shock. "Are you sure, Eleanor?" Judge Brennan asked quietly. "You have every right to pursue this." Eleanor nodded. "I'm sure. More conflict won't solve anything." She turned to face Karen directly. "But I do have one request." Karen stared at her suspiciously. "What?" "I'd like you to agree to stay off my property unless invited," Eleanor said simply. "And I'll promise the same about your property." Officer Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "That's a reasonable request, Ms. Whitman." Karen seemed at a loss for words. She clearly hadn't expected mercy from the woman she had been tormenting for months. "Fine," she muttered finally. "I'll stay off your property." Officer Stevens made a note in his book. "Ms. Whitman, you still need to appear in court for the citation regarding misuse of emergency services, but Ms. Williams' decision not to press trespassing charges is a fortunate outcome for you." Karen clutched the yellow citation paper, looking deflated and confused by this turn of events. The anger seemed to drain from her, replaced by uncertainty. "We'll be going now," Officer Stevens said, "but we may need to follow up with both of you later." As the officers walked back to their patrol car, the neighbors began to disperse slowly. Many stopped to pat Eleanor's shoulder or offer words of support before heading home. Diane Chen lingered behind, concern still evident on her face. "Are you sure about not pressing charges, Miss Eleanor?" she asked. "After everything she did." Eleanor smiled gently. "My grandmother used to say that hatred is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I'm too old to poison myself with hatred, dear." James Wilson approached with a glass of cold sweet tea from his mother. "Miss Eleanor, my mom sent this over for you, and she wants you to know dinner will be ready at 6 if you'd like to come over." "Tell her thank you, James." "I'd love to," Eleanor replied with a warm smile. As the final neighbors drifted away, Eleanor found herself alone in her garden with Karen still standing awkwardly by the fence. The two women looked at each other in silence for a long moment. "Why?" Karen finally asked, her voice smaller than Eleanor had ever heard it. "Why didn't you press charges?" Eleanor stood and walked slowly to the fence, her gardening tools gathered neatly in their basket. "Because punishment doesn't change hearts, Karen. Only kindness has a chance of doing that." Karen looked away, unable to meet Eleanor's eyes. I don't understand you." "You don't need to understand me," Eleanor replied. "You just need to be a good neighbor. That's all any of us can ask of each other." Eleanor turned and began walking toward her porch, then paused and looked back. "My tomatoes will be ripe next week. There are always too many for just me. If you'd like some, you're welcome to stop by, with an invitation this time." Without waiting for a response, Eleanor continued to her house, her steps slow but steady. Behind her, Karen stood motionless by the fence, the yellow citation still clutched in her hand. The following Saturday, as Eleanor worked in her garden under the warm morning sun, she heard a hesitant knock on her fence gate. She looked up to see Karen standing there, without her usual scowl. Instead, she looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. "Good morning," Karen said stiffly. I noticed your tomatoes look ripe." Eleanor smiled and gestured to the garden bench. "They are? Would you like to help me pick some?" Karen hesitated, then slowly opened the gate and stepped into the garden properly invited for the first time. "I brought these," she said, holding out a pair of new gardening gloves. Well, I thought you might be able to use them." Eleanor accepted the peace offering with a nod. "Thank you. Every gardener needs good gloves." She handed Karen a small basket. "The best tomatoes are on the plants near the greenhouse." As they worked side by side in the garden, Eleanor began to tell stories about each plant, where the seeds had come from, which ones her mother had taught her to grow, which vegetables her late husband had loved best. Slowly, Karen's tense shoulders relaxed, and she began to ask questions about the garden. It wasn't friendship yet. That would take much more time and effort. But it was a beginning, a small seed of understanding planted in fertile soil, and Eleanor, who had spent her life nurturing growing things, knew better than most how to cultivate what was planted with patience and care.